listening to the House by the Video Store podcast.
There's no more room in hell. The dead will walk here.
We have such sights to show you.
I kick ass for the Lord.
Praise God.
Welcome to the House by the Video Store podcast. I'm your host, William. Joe Medale be Sean.
Hello.
And on this episode, we'll be discussing The Silence of the Lambs, the Oscar-winning film that starred Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, Ted Levine, and...
Directed by Jonathan... Is
Demme?
it Demme? Yeah, Demme.
Demme.
I used to say Dim because I assumed the E was silent, but yeah.
And like we said in the last episode from 1991, it was just a movie that was the last kind of like genre-esque movie that was, a big awards winner and critically lauded and acclaimed and a huge box office success. Because since then, horror has not really been nominated for much, or films that could even fall into the kind of horror genre at all. And then this year you have Get Out, which is nominated. And then you have The Shape of Water, which, while not necessarily horror, is a huge genre film. It's about a fish man. So it's just one of those years where you have horror. People are saying, like, okay, you can have horror that's a huge critical success and a huge box office success and actually gets awards recognition. Because a lot of times horror movies that get well reviewed and make a lot of money don't get much awards consideration beyond possibly like makeup or sound effects or something. And even then, it's pretty rare that horror films even get those technical nominations. So the Silence of the Lambs is a movie that I thought would be a good time to revisit just because you have these new movies in contention. And it's just a movie that, was so instrumental in a lot of things. I feel like Silence of the Lambs helped lead to the popularity of like the X-Files, because being an FBI agent and stuff like that you had Silence of the Lambs, Twin Peaks, X-Files, like FBI agents, it was like much more of a defined genre or something that was much more story material after that, seemingly. And Silence of the Lambs like did it so well that it inspired a lot of things after that.
Well, too, it feels like the blueprint for like Seven.
Yeah,
in some regard, and Zodiac.
Yeah, like I don't think you have some of the Fincher stuff like Seven without Silence of the Lambs first. And I don't know that the success. I don't know, like Dana Scully and Clarice Starling, like are both great role models for young women. FBI agents who are women that aren't relying on others to save them, and you have like all that era. And then you have just an awesome villain in the movie, and not even like a villain in the traditional sense, but more of just like the net like. You don't get because Anthony Hopkins is in the movie and won the Oscar, and he's only in it for like 15 minutes. So people I don't think realize like how little he's actually in that movie.
He's like the shark from Jaws.
Yeah, and he's not in it a ton. He's very impactful when he's in it, but I think so many things stole from that portrayal and parodied it after that.
Yes.
That's the reason I think Anthony Hopkins, as great as he was as Hannibal Lecter, I don't think he can play the role anymore. And like after Silence of the Lambs, you had Hannibal years later, in the early 2000s, that was directed by Ridley Scott. And Jodie Foster wasn't back. Jonathan Demme wasn't back directing. So you had Juliette Moore. And
you had to settle for Julianne Moore and Ridley Scott.
Julianne Moore.
We're just in the slums.
So you had,
but no, it's not the same mojo.
I mean, top-notch talent in a movie that made a lot of money in Hannibal. It's just that it felt like it went more for the gore and schlock than Silence of the Lambs, and it was less about the kind of development of Starling. And so you had that, and then you had Red Dragon, which is the Brett Ratner directed reboot or redo of the Red Dragon novel, which was originally done as Manhunter in 1986 by Michael Mann, with William Peterson in the role of Will Graham and Brian Cox in the role of Hannibal Lecter, and Tom Noonan as Francis Dollarhide. And then in the new one, it was what's his name, Voldemort.
I don't know who Voldemort is.
Give me 1 second. Ralph Fiennes.
Okay.
So he's, great actor. So you had those different iterations. But I think by Red Dragon, it became like, okay, Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Hannibal Lecter is so iconic and so now copied and parodied that it's harder to take it with a straight face. But watching Silence of the Lambs for the first time, or I'm sure watching that, if somebody's never seen any of those and never seen any of the parodies and is only watching it for the first time, he's a very chilling person. And, Ted Levine's character of John Gunn, like he's entertaining in his own right too. So a lot of stuff going on. And there's also the TV show Hannibal where Mads Mikkelsen played Hannibal and it went a completely different direction, which I think had to be done for that character to really be relevant again. But before we discuss Silence of the Lambs, we can go through some things we've been watching to recommend. I think the only thing I would like to chime in on is The Circle, which is directed by James Ponsoldt and has Tom Hanks and Emma Watson and John Boyega and Patton Oswalt, and is a movie that only watched it because we were sitting on the couch, me and Julie were, and trying to figure out what to watch. And we just kept scrolling back and forth, and we're like, fuck it, let's just watch this. Like, it's got Tom Hanks. It can't be that bad. And it's got a Metacritic score of 43 and a IMDb user score of 5.3 out of 10. And it's about like a Facebook or Google type company. And Emma Watson works there and rises up the ranks and then finds out that they have plans for different projects that she thinks are going too far. And then she tries to stop it. But to me, it feels very unrealistic, and it goes in so many directions. It never zeroes in on a single thread, so it all just kind of feels blah. And then there's some acting from some of the... She has a friend named Mercer, I believe, that's like her childhood friend, that like there was maybe some flirtation there. And then she goes away to work for the big company. Oh, and also had Bill Paxton, one of his last roles.
Oh, yeah.
So, he did a good job. He plays a character that has MS, multiple sclerosis. And he seemingly does a very good job portraying that. And what he is given, he does okay. He's just not in it much. But it just feels like it picks up a lot of threads and doesn't really go far enough with them. And Emma Watson, so Hermione, all that stuff, like she's obviously not an American. She plays an American. And to me, it just felt like you could... Sometimes when you watch stuff and you can see like a British actor like struggling with an American dialect, it felt like that with her. Like her vowels often, you could be like... It's like
when you see a Canadian actor, you're like, hey, they're Canadian. You can kind of tell every now and then.
And I'm sure when people who are, different dialects and accents watch Americans try to portray stuff, they're like, that's not very... So it just felt like her casting, like she did good enough with what she was given. Just the movie really wasn't written in a compelling way. And it felt just like a generic version of like what I ended up saying was, it was like a very bland, boring episode of Black Mirror with the best cast they ever assembled. Yeah. And this does feel like it could fit into one of those. It just, there's a lot of things that felt like it weren't too far off from the way things are now. Like if somebody goes to work at Facebook and they don't actively use Facebook, they'll get chastised by coworkers. Like there's things like that in the movie. It just doesn't, it's all surface level. And then like one of the ideas is they make these little small cameras that can connect to a satellite uplink and can share video. So if you put those cameras all over the world, you can have video everywhere. And for human rights violations, you can see like regimes that are abusing their people. You can see crimes occur. Eventually you can use the power of all these connected cameras to try to track down criminals or to find specific people. And it's just the company keeps taking these things further and further. And it's like, oh, well, since, out of the voting age population in the U.S., only 50% vote, like we have 90% of those people on our social media service. What if we made it so that signing up for our service also signs you up to vote and you make voting mandatory? So you see all these elements where the social media network could try to usurp power and become like the power broker and replace the government, but it never goes far enough. And you never really know if Tom Hanks' character, which is kind of like a weird Steve Jobs-ish type, you never know if he's really bad or good. If he's genuine in his intentions or just looking to, take control and power through the guise of helping society and altruism. Patton Oswalt's kind of wasted. So it's just like you have these elements. They never dive enough into any of them to really go anywhere. And I think there's episodes of Black Mirror that handle social media stuff better. And then the last episode, we talked about Tragedy Girls. That's about social media stuff. So contrasting this movie against that is just like like in that, and John Boyega's good. Doesn't get a lot to do. Just the movie, and Karen Gillan's in it too. So she was recently in like the Guardians of the Galaxy's movies as Nebula, and I think she was on Doctor Who before, or one of those BBC shows. Don't come at me on that. I don't remember. I never really watched Doctor Who. The BBC stuff I've watched is like Sherlock and Luther and the old Top Gear before they fired everybody. But like for the cast the movie had, it should have had a much better end result.
Yeah.
And it just kind of came away feeling like generic tech company. It didn't feel all that realistic.
Yeah. The trailers, it was like, okay, cool. This could be cool. It could be fine. But then the cast has kind of sold me on it. But then the reviews came out and they were pretty mediocre to low or something, I remember.
Yeah,
I was like, I'll pass on this. And I kept seeing that on streaming myself. And I just thought, there's so many other movies on here.
And it
so I'm glad you bit the bullet.
It's not really like a thriller. There's not like any thrilling elements.
That's the bummer part, because it could have leaned into that pretty
because
heavy.
like you start to see like maybe there is like the thriller element of this person that's within the beast itself starts seeing what's going on and then wants to stop it. But it really doesn't go in that direction. It's much more surface level, and like honestly, like I would recommend if somebody hasn't seen it, go back and watch The Social Network. Go back and watch these other things, like seeing how a lot of these social media platforms exist in Silicon Valley stuff in general. I think is mostly just the hubris of the creator. They get a good idea, and then sometimes they buy so much into their own hype and their own BS. They're like, oh, this will save humanity, and they buy into it. If you watch TED Talks, some of those TED Talks are hard to watch from people who really believe that they're photo sharing, or maybe not TED Talks, but just like general like press conferences.
I mean, Silicon Valley leans into that a lot.
Yeah, Silicon Valley.
Critical of it.
Actually, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Watch Silicon Valley instead, because the movie, like, and you know, it shows like, oh, Becca's in it giving a concert on the campus of the place, so it's very much like the height of like MySpace hubris, where they used to have like big name performers and things like that. So it does a bunch of different things that may be close to how those companies operate, but it's in this shiny wrapper that feels very unrealistic, and then it never really delves deep enough into anything, and you never really know what anybody's true intentions are.
Yeah.
So you're just kind of like, oh, and then like John Boyega is supposed to be the one that created most of the stuff this site is built on, and then he's just like mid-20s, so he would have literally had to done it when he was like in his teens. Not that Mark Zuckerberg.
Mark Zuckerberg?
Mark Zuckerberg had Facebook created in the way to be in a huge empire in his mid-20s, so it's not impossible. But it's just like the movie didn't really give you enough from any of the like Tom Hanks or Patton Oswalt to really know like, do they have ill intentions, or do they just see the potential to quote unquote save humanity and then push things that could actually be really detrimental? There's not enough there. Yeah,
there hasn't been. The Social Network was a great film on. I was thinking about that a little bit. I don't know why I was thinking. Maybe I was thinking about social media, and it just touches on some things like, why do people use social media? What do they want to know?
Yeah,
and that big, it's like, oh, relationship status. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because people want to have sex with each other. That was just a little thing that kind of, in some ways, got to the crux of why some people use social media. You know what I mean? It was a simple little thing, even though Aaron Sorkin didn't even use Facebook. But there hasn't been a really great modern film that I have seen that really dives into social media and really goes at it from an angle that that isn't so obvious.
Well, I think too, like the sequel to The Social Network, I mean, maybe not even be like a real autobiographical type movie, but just so Facebook was created for the reasons it was. Mark Zuckerberg's, taking these ideas that were decent ideas for things that didn't exist and there was an appetite for, and then just his own hubris feeling the need to create this empire. So the interesting thing to me is, once you've created it, what do you do with it? Like they talk about how, oh, this technology can change the world and this can help people's lives. Do they believe that? Or is it just part of the PR shine they put on their desire to wield more power?
Yeah, it's definitely changed the world, and maybe, in some ways, or at least,
like, I would wonder, like, is there a correlation between the suicide rate and social media?
Yeah.
Is there a correlation between depression and social? So there's all these things, like, and two, just knowing, like, are the people running these sites, do they really have the altruistic means in mind that they talk about at these conferences?
No, it's hard too because so much of it is regulated by people. You know what I mean? And people are totally, imperfect, and it's just
It's like, hasn't like Facebook done really tone deaf things like VR tours of like impoverished areas?
Yeah,
and just things that like
he says he's going to try to fix it, but
so it's just
we'll
one of those things where like I think that's the more interesting aspect to it, and then the movie just didn't do that at all. So it's out there on Amazon Prime streaming. Unless you're like a diehard have to see everything Tom Hanks does fan, and even then he's not a huge part of the movie, I wouldn't really recommend checking it out. I'd rather, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch The Social Network or watch Silicon Valley and HBO. There are other places you can get a similar, similar subject matter and a better actual movie. Yeah. And then that was really all I had time to watch this week.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I watched a little bit of Extract today too. The Mike Judge
Jason
film.
Bateman.
Yeah, Mike Judge film.
Yeah.
Speaking of Silicon Valley, I saw that in theaters when I came out and watched it again a while back, and today I was watching it, and I really, really enjoyed that film. Office Space too, Yeah. And Idiocracy, I liked it at the time. I knew what to expect going into it, and I overall enjoyed it. And then now I'm waiting to revisit that again too.
It's a movie that had a lot of prescience when it came to determining what would happen in the future.
Yes, yeah.
In terms of the dumbing down of people and the way
people thought it was a little too stupid, and it is the goofiest film he's done by far. But at the same time, now it is seeming more and more relevant. And it's
on that movie, you had a president that was a pro wrestler, and currently we have a president who's in the WWE Hall of Fame.
Yes, yeah.
So it just shows you like sometimes ridiculous satire can be somewhat telling for the future.
Yeah. So two other things I watched, not really horror related too much, but I watched Good Times. I told you and Derek about this, which is Robert Pattinson. A film he's in, and the directors, it's two, I believe, brothers. They share the last name. Heard a lot of good buzz about this film. It's super stellar. First of all, I think he's great in it. I watched him in that Cronenberg film as well, and I liked him in that. Wherever he's in the limo going around town. I don't remember the name of that, but he's great in this film. It's very funny, very naturalistic dialogue. It's a crime film, but it is like the lowest level criminal. Like this is the criminals you see scrambling around and really not having much of a plan and being very reactive to things. Yeah. And a little bit desperate. Like he has some plans, but there's also people he comes in contact with that are just low level people needing to get money. Yeah. And you see like how sideways things can go when people are act irrationally or on impulse sometimes, and the characters feel very real and well written. Like it feels like the writers or directors like hung out, like are part of that world or have been in their past, the same way Scorsese grew up with family members that were Italian mobsters and stuff. Like it feels very much like this is coming from a real place, and that's why it's so fascinating and good. And it takes place primarily over a single night, so there's always this forward momentum because there's always this pressure going on. Yeah. And so basically the story is Robert Pattinson is looking to get money or enough money to post bond for his brother or to get him out of jail somehow. Yeah. So it is about that. Jennifer Jason Leigh's also in it. Unfortunately, not a ton. Yeah. But she is very, very funny and awesome in that. Very eccentric, Yeah. And yeah, it's just great. It looks great too. I was like, what did they shoot this on? They shot this on Kodak 35 millimeter. And I think it was kind of guerrilla style in some regards. Definitely looks like it. But at the same time, it's not the sort of guerrilla style that looks like they just grabbed the camera and just started spraying and then try to put together the film in the editing. Everything feels very deliberate, and it's a beautiful looking film. This DP, I'm going to start following his work. I haven't looked up much about it because I just watched it like maybe 2 days ago and watched a couple things since then that I also talked about in the last podcast. But I highly recommend that since it's on Amazon Prime. It's very, very good and surprising in some aspects. And then also, because I subscribe to the Film Struck and Criterion, I finally watched Blow Up. It's like an Italian British film. Michelangelo Antonio I don't know. It's from, I think, from like 1960. So the reason I watched this is because I had Blow Out, the De Palma film with John Travolta, is like one of my favorite films. It's my favorite De Palma film. It is a thriller. That film is a thriller where John Travolta plays a sound recordist for films, and he's getting Foley sound. I think I probably described the plot before. He's outside getting Foley sound for a movie, and he's getting wind and stuff, and suddenly the tires on a car blow out, and the car crashes and goes into a river, and then there is a dead body involved and all this stuff. So he has a sound recording, and it is a kind of a conspiracy thriller, sets in motion from there. You know, De Palma takes a lot from Hitchcock, so it is very much tightly woven into being heavily into suspense and the thriller aspect. And so it is him listening to the sound recordings, and then I think there's some other elements that get brought in. And so basically people are after him trying to get the recording because there was a political figure in the vehicle. And so it all starts spiraling out of control from there. I think that film is phenomenal. And it's also, too, on Stars. I noticed when I was looking through the movies they have on there. So I'd always heard that was inspired by Blow Up, which is a film that is similar concept where a photographer is taking pictures in a park and he accidentally takes pictures of a murder in progress. Yeah. And so I thought, okay, that's cool. You know, he basically remade Blow Up, you know, many years later, through his own lens, and which his own lens is sometimes very Hitchcockian. But wow, this film is not a thriller at all. Yeah. And I think it's very good. It's very much, you know, you sometimes watch some of those films. I've only seen bits and pieces of a lot of British films from the era, but sometimes it's just people going about their day or whatever. You know, it's a day in a life on some of those films. And it is very much that. So an hour into this film, he's finally looking at the picture and discovering that there was a murder. And the film's only like an hour and a half long. Yeah. It is very much like, it is about the fashion photographer. He's a fashion photographer in Britain in the 60s. And it is about his day. And he's kind of a shitty person. Yeah. And so oftentimes those are more interesting characters. You know, he is very much, he takes advantage of some girls that want to be models, you know. He is very, you know, passive to people and just kind of an asshole in some regards, but it makes him an interesting character and somebody who seems real. But I was watching some of the special features on Film Structure, and they talked about how in the 60s, of course, this was the new era of fashion because, you know, fashion, a lot of people, when I was younger, I was like, oh yeah, the people in the fashion world wear really stupid stuff like garbage bags, you know, like that sort of thing. And it's more of an abstract thing that the normal person wouldn't wear. Yeah. And that's when fashion started exploding. The fashion world really changed like in the 60s. So this is almost like a time capsule of Britain in the 60s when the fashion world really changed. And in that regard, it's really fascinating. And it is just kind of watching this character go along. And if you are a person who needs plot and kind of you don't have time to kind of just be absorbed in the world of certain films, and this is not your film, it is from a different era, but it had me thinking of a quote I heard from somebody. I don't know who it was, but I think about it sometimes, and I think they said, like, plot is bullshit. Like, that is not what you should be making your film about. Yeah. And different filmmakers have different approaches. But this is definitely one of those films because it is like the last half hour. And some of it is about the transformation of a certain character also in regards to this picture that is taken and stuff. But I recommend the film for sure, but if you watch this film, don't think De Palma's film is in any way like that. There are two different films, so it's interesting to see what De Palma did, what he took from this little nugget of an ideal that is, you know, it's what the film is about, but really it's only about that for about a half hour of the last part of the film. But he made a thriller where that the opening's almost the opening scene of Blowout. I think it's probably, you know, maybe the first 10 minutes he's recording these sounds, and then things start getting kicked off into motion about 20 minutes in, and then it's just like a rocket from there. So it's interesting to see that it's not just a straight remake or retelling, and kind of his ideal for that. It almost makes me respect Blowout more because it is taking some little ideal much further than I thought he had even done. Yeah. So yeah, that's basically just two mentions. Go watch Blowout for sure, though, and Good Times.
Yep. So now I can move into our discussion of The Silence of the Lambs, which is from 1991 and directed by Jonathan Demme, stars Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, plenty of others, and we'll do full spoiler discussion throughout.
Roger Corman.
Because if you haven't watched the movie at this point, it was on Netflix for a long time. Now it's not on Netflix anymore.
The Criterion disc came out. And I wonder if that's why, if they didn't renew because they knew Criterion was going to be putting a disc out.
I'm not sure. I'm sure it was probably where they got the rights bundled with a bunch of other stuff through other parties and just expired. And they probably didn't want it to be renewed if it was going to be on new disc release.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, they just didn't renew that deal.
Because I know, like the one you borrowed from me, I just had the Hannibal Lecter collection, which was Manhunter, Silence of the Lambs, and Hannibal. Didn't have Red Dragon, which is not a huge tragedy because that version, it's not a terrible movie. It's just when you rewatch these movies in context, there's a marked difference between each of them. Like Manhunter, the Michael Mann one from '86, feels very 80s. There's neon, there's cold colored lighting, and it just has a very 80s look. And Silence of the Lambs is a much more staid, I would just say highbrow look at the material, kind of.
Yeah, I was watching some of the special features, and I can't think of the name. Costume designer.
Yeah.
She said she intentionally tried to make the costume seem less not era specific at all. You know, they still are. You can see some patterns on her shirt that feels very 90s, early 90s, but the intention was to not make it feel like it was of that era, so it would feel like the film could take place at any time. Well, I mean, and it definitely, the whole film feels like that.
Yeah.
It still feels like it takes place in 1990 or 91, but it is not in your face.
It's not locked into the era as much. There's not posters of the 1989 Batman movie everywhere.
No.
And there's not, Queen songs and I mean, because the movie, some of the costuming and the hairstyles and things are of that era, but the movie itself has a more timeless feel to it because a lot of some of the movie shows kind of more white trash characters, and a lot of those locales and stuff feel the same today. They just have a smartphone.
Yeah.
Or just the houses and the stuff that they go to, and the cars and stuff dated a little bit, but and two, just it's refreshing to watch movies like this after having watched Tragedy Girls, and there's no social media aspect to it. There's just traditional news media, and that's kind of it.
Yeah, because really, I mean, you can make a film about that, about social media and these little elements, but the most interesting things often is the human element, you know what I mean? And about making films about humans, and those things are universal and are timeless, Well,
and two, the movie itself, the title is The Silence of the Lambs, and it's how the book too, and that ties into what the movie is kind of about. Clarice Starling saving somebody, and then by doing so, trying to silence the lambs that haunt her from childhood, and the fact that she couldn't save the little lamb. So thematically, the movie is operating on a few levels, and then just in terms of straight tension and drama and thriller elements, it has those too, because like I said, the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter performance has been so parodied and ripped off and talked up so much, and the fact that he won an Oscar for it too just kind of ratcheted up the exposure on it and the discussion of it. If you take that element away, it's still a very good performance, and he's playing it and he seems like a very scary person, but he's also at the same time civilized and comes across as a very complex villain. He's not just the Leatherface style killer from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He is a more nuanced killer.
It's almost scarier because he's he's a doctor. You know what I mean? He's an intelligent
doctor
person, so. It's almost like, oh, this could be anybody, And what he does is probably one of the most, generally speaking, horrifying things. People getting murdered, that happens all the time everywhere. But eating another person, that's another element that's another element that is another step disturbing. That is not a normal activity. Murder, I mean, that is almost like a human instinct in some regards.
It's unfortunately a fact of life. Yes, murders will occur.
It is, and it happens all the time. But eating someone is a step outside of that. And when that happens, you remember. We had a cannibal case here in town. You know what I mean? That was a huge thing. It's right across the river. It was in Indiana, of course, and not in Louisville. But
I mean, too, like in the movie, so that's the reason like I was a big fan of the show Hannibal, which you should check out because I think it's still on Amazon Prime, or at least season 1 is. But the show Hannibal is a prequel to Even Red Dragon, which is the prequel to Silence of the Lambs. So, or not prequel, just the book in the series before that, and then the movie that, like Manhunter. But that's just about Hannibal Lecter in the wild when he was still a practicing doctor, as like a psychiatrist. And it just shows like what he was like out in the world, like when he was eating people and killing people, because it's kind of touched on in Red Dragon and Hannibal and these other books, like, what he did before, when he wasn't in captivity. Like in Hannibal, there's a scene, so spoiler for Hannibal in the first 20 minutes, somebody in the orchestra or the chorus or the performing musical group that he went to see, one of the musicians is like not very good. So he then kills that musician and invites a bunch of people over and then feeds that musician to his party guest. So it's just showing like all the messed up things about Hannibal Lecter. The, socialite who's, very well in tune with, music and culture and clothing and all these, sophisticated taste. And he's also eating people. So
I think that would be a good turn for Frasier. That would be great.
The entire time,
yeah,
double Niles and Frasier are just going to town and eating people. But yeah, like, so you have those terrifying elements, and then you have like Clarice being kind of the more wide-eyed, not FBI agent yet, FBI like agent in training, who was being kind of manipulated by her boss, Jack Crawford, because he just knew that Hannibal would probably be interested in her, and sending in someone without an agenda would be a way to possibly get information out of him. And like, so you have the element too of like, well, in the game of tug of war, like, who's really the bad guys in this movie.
And two, the female perspective is super important too. Also, and it is very much what this film is about. It's even the way Demi shoots the film, often like in one of the earlier scenes, she goes in the elevator and all the men towering around.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's so many things like that, and how they talk about her when they're like, let's talk about the details when she's not in the room and stuff. Like,
yeah.
And I appreciate that too, that it is from a female perspective, because sometimes we hear films that are praised, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong or one way or the other, where they're like, oh, this was written for a male and we put a female in there.
Yeah.
That's totally fine. But there's also more to appreciate sometimes when it is specifically a female perspective, even though the book was written by a male. It adds another layer and it puts you in that world. And we talked about identifying with films and characters and tragedy girls in the last one. Like, we don't identify with her, but the character's so well written, we're put into that world and her perspective, and it's a rich story and character to get invested in.
Yeah, and too, like you said, the elements of seeing like Clarice go in a room with Jack Crawford, and there's like all the local sheriffs and sheriff's deputies and police officers, and it's all men, and they're all just kind of looking at her.
And it's all that looking nearly into the camera that Demi does in this, and that, was, I think some people thought was risky at the time. Like, hey, don't have them look directly into the lens almost. Like, but that was a huge defining factor to this film and why it worked so much, because it got in the psychology of all the characters, and this film is all about perspective, and it's a lot of times her perspective on what she's seeing in this world. Yeah,
because you have like you said too, the elements of it is it it gently touched on the elements of sexism in any workplace, but in that movie specifically in law enforcement, how it's very much a boys' club, and the women were either like, were they as Hannibal even talked about, like, did Clarice think that Jack Crawford was into her? So it's more of like, are they just seen as like possible objects of sexual desire? Were they just seen as pawns to get other things done? Where because like Crawford going to talk with the sheriff in the other room could just be people like, okay, people from my level and above need to go in here and discuss this. People beneath that, because I've been in like the workplace and been in meetings where like a director or somebody has like people step out to discuss things with someone else, and that's normal. But the element of that adds to it is like everybody just staring at Clarice, and then that element like lightly touched on throughout, but just helps show you and cement you and like give you more of her perspective. And then as you mentioned too, like the looking at the camera stuff. So the conversations between Clarice and Hannibal are kind of like a masterclass on blocking out a shot and framing and using the camera perspective and angles and lenses to accentuate like who has the upper hand in the conversation and where things going.
What's the video? Is it Every Frame a Painting, or what video? The Tony Zhu series?
I think they did one.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple of breakdowns of this film that are very good on YouTube.
Yeah, because I've seen a few. I've seen like ones that are more recent too, and it just as you see like as a character is framed larger or smaller in the frame in contrast to the other character, like who has the upper hand, who has information, who's being played, who's playing. So there's all that kind of dance that's going on. And two, making it more frightening is like a lot of times Hannibal, when he's looking at camera, he's looking at you, and there's not really the glass between him because a lot of times you see his face. So the audience is more of like being confronted with this man that is like this brutal, cold killer. And like most of the movie, he's behind glass, so he's not much of an immediate threat. It's only when he escapes at the end that you like wonder, or there's even the possibility that he could really harm anybody once he escapes from police custody. And to that itself, he set up like that kind of tableau of like the officer that like was kind of cut open and hung up on the cage. And then all that stuff, and that was like a very terrifying scene, and just showed that like the entire movie.
He pulled a Halloween H2O Michael Myers.
Yeah,
when he puts on the costume of the other person, and you think he's the one in the van.
Yeah, I mean, and two, like like the escape.
Yeah,
the entire movie, he's been kind of Clarice's helper. He's been seen as like you've been told he's a terrible person, but you haven't really seen it. And then this one, like when you finally see that scene in the room he was being held in, and you see that those other cops who were innocent and were just doing their job and were treating him with respect when they did it, you see how like viciously they were dispatched. And so then it reminds you that Hannibal's not just a quirky helper. Yeah. He's a bad guy.
Yeah.
He is a nuanced character.
But also he's like a necessary evil too. That's also the fascinating thing where they need his help to catch Buffalo Bill.
I mean, so they like two cops die in order for them to save this one girl. But then it also stops Buffalo Bill from killing future women as well. And you can get into a whole discussion about, police officers who sign up to be officers versus civilians and, whatever. But the victory, does go to Starling. They do find who Buffalo Bill is and stop it.
I love that scene at the end, too, with the cross-cutting between the police officers going into the house.
Yeah.
And, the first time through, you think, oh, they're about to bust in on him. And then Clarice pops through the door. Yeah. I like it's just so... It's such a wonderful cinematic tool that was used so well in this film and at the climax and at the right time in the movie.
Well, and two, when you think about the movie, though, the majority of the major discoveries were kind of led on by Hannibal pushing Clarice in the right direction. And then her coming upon James Gumb was more coincidence than, super solid hunches, because she was just following up with one of the victims and trying to tie up all the loose ends on that, and went to talk to one of the victims' like coworkers, and she stated that they had helped with like dress alterations or something for this older woman. And when she goes to then follow up with her to get any information is when she comes across the killer, Buffalo Bill, who had killed that old woman and been using her home as his base of operations. And, I'm assuming using her materials to do the stitching of the bodies and stuff. So,
and that turn too, when she sees the moth, like that is a phenomenal, again, a phenomenal climax to her realization and the tension that is built right there. Like it's just, and the bug guys in the film too are also hilarious and wonderful. And they also use it to a good effect of looking into the camera for comedic effect almost because of his cockeye, and he's hitting on her as well too. Like there's a whole other dynamic going on there.
And with him, it's I hate to say the word like harmless, but he's more of like
he's
innocent. He's more innocently interested in her and doing it in a more gentle way. Yeah. And then you have
he's being forward too. He's not being like beating around the bush or anything.
Then you literally have in the institution Miggs, who is masturbating and throws his semen on her. So you have like the literal manifestation of like male gaze and sexuality and seeing someone as an object. You have the guy trying to get a date more innocently and just as an acquaintance. And then you have like all the guys like staring her down and towering over her and kind of just using her as a pawn to get what they want. And then, Hannibal seems to be the one who's more interested in what Clarice is thinking and feeling. And, he even calls her after they've caught or, killed the Buffalo Bill, and then ask her about this, about if she still hears the lamb. So you have he's the one that seemingly cares more about the why and how of Starling, as everyone else is just more concerned with the end result of the case.
Yeah.
And then you have the moment where Hannibal is dealing with the governor, and she's signing the paperwork, and he's asking about, did you breastfeed her?
He's so manipulative.
And he just takes it, he gets perverse pleasure out of just making her think that he's asking a legitimate question that'll help find her. And then he's just tugging and pushing and prodding and playing with them. And at that point, everybody should have realized he did this on purpose. He didn't do this. He wasn't at the behest of someone else. He took advantage of this opportunity, knowing what he could do, because he escaped. And then, you two have the warden at the mental institution, who's incredibly slimy and creepy. And, he's another one that's kind of interested in Starling, and then kind of dismissive and kind of a jerk when she doesn't kind of go along with his plans. And then when she kind of turns it back around, when, he's kind of showing her around, then she goes to talk to Lecter and says she wants to do it alone. He's kind of upset, and she's like, well, I wouldn't have had your great company.
Yeah. So he's I wouldn't waste my time coming down here.
Yeah. So he's just basically if I didn't, I wanted the glory and to possibly bang you. And then I'm not getting any of it. And then she kind of throws it back in his face. And it's so I just like that dynamic of an instance where she had some of the power in the situation.
It is very much about the types of people women, seemingly have to deal with on a normal basis through the workplace and, through everyday life. It is, the Me Too thing or whatever. But just the fact that, I don't know, this film is very much about that. And I don't know many other films around this era that were about that. Honestly, 9 to 5, the Dolly Parton film, that also deals with workplace harassment and stuff that. But
I'm sure that there was stuff from here and there that touched on it, but something on such a big platform that got to be so recognized.
And it wasn't, it wasn't done in broad strokes either. You know what I mean? It was very much ingrained in the film.
And it wasn't the focus.
Yes, and it wasn't the focus. It was this is just part of her everyday life. This isn't the focus of the story, but this is a reality to what she would have to go through to even get to this point of trying to solve. It's another hurdle she has to fight that men in this environment don't even have to think about,
it just layers added into what is an incredibly solid thriller horror film, or, drama. And you have the FBI stuff. So it shows more of the, procedural type stuff. And then, you have the police work that goes into it and tracking down the leads that Lecter finds. And there is some disturbing imagery in the movie. Because for whatever reason, the close-ups on the moths and the maggots and the caterpillars and stuff that stuff was interesting visuals. But the Hannibal Lecter escape set piece is the big gore effect in the movie. But you have all these elements that just kind of ground you in a believable world, establish you on the side of your protagonist and show you her struggle and not beating you over the head with it and making it the point Aaron Brockovich or something. Which is a different type of movie altogether, but just kind of subtly shows you here's what she has to deal with through every step of this, and people don't take her, seriously, and all these different things. And then the people she deals with professionally, Barney, one of the caretakers at the mental institution, he's one of the most straightforward level people she deals with, who doesn't really treat her any differently than anyone else. So you see people who are kind of just in the midst of jobs and who are kind of mid-tier are often less manipulative than people that have any notion of power.
Yeah, well, and two, I was thinking of the old man that runs the storage unit too.
Yeah,
he's very just
operates normally.
Yes, yeah,
and doesn't really offer to do anything more to help her than he would a man. He's just kind of
because he knows he's checked out. He's ran his course in life.
Yeah, so you have those elements, and then you have the very iconic, it puts the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
Yeah, which I saw Joe Dirt before this.
Yeah.
And it didn't deflate that scene at all. But again, talking about parodies, I think Cable Guy, I love that parody. And then Joe Dirt and then Clerks 2.
Yeah,
So that scene, the goodbye horses scene too in this film, that's also, it almost, humor can kind of deflate things. It's very weird. It's a very weird scene, but also like, oh man, okay, we're getting into the nitty gritty of what this character Buffalo Bill is about.
Yeah.
You're seeing more of, his MO and like what he is.
Well, and you learn more about him just from hearing like through the conversations with Clarice and Lecter, like what he's actually trying to do, and then you see him doing it and not discussing why.
And it's very, I think, sensitive and smart of them too to say, hey, he's not actually a transgender or transvestite because they aren't typically violent. Like they make sure not to lean on that as being like, ooh, this is a taboo thing. We can just say this person's a villain because they are a crossdresser or whatever. They make sure to say, hey, he's not actually one.
Yeah.
He's more just he's more of somebody who doesn't know
what he
doesn't
is.
confuse at all, so he just thinks he is.
Yeah.
I think that was that didn't date the film as either. Like that could have really hurt this film, but this film is still just held up, I think, in every aspect.
Because like you said, like I think like the only thing is like the terminology they used was like, is he a transvestite?
Yeah.
I think now it'd just be like, is he transsexual or transgender?
Yes.
But even then, like Lecter's like, no, he's not actually. He probably doesn't know what he is. And it's just this guy that wants to change from what he is to something else, and then just goes about these extreme means to do it. So it doesn't lean into the stereotype of like evil gay guys or evil, transgender people.
It doesn't demonize any specific group because it's an easy target or is something known as different.
Because you have some movies like, say, Sleepaway Camp that you could argue about like how negative its final message is in like today's context.
But thankfully, though, that person had been through something disturbing.
Yeah.
Very disturbing and a disturbing upbringing.
Yeah.
So it was another layer.
But then you have other stuff like, without spoiling, like Terror Train has like some elements of that.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of movies where you have characters, a lot of times it's either gay characters are killed off, or they're just like evil and that's why, or like transgender characters or something. And that movie is more of he's just a depraved psychotic guy, and he's looking for outlets to initiate his change. And Red Dragon is a similar movie too, in that the main character is wanting to literally turn into like the Red Dragon through like killing people and transforming and changing. So I think a lot of the movies, like, or not the movies, but the books like Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs, it's about this killer that wants to create transition and change to something else through their victims. And it doesn't really matter what the inspiration is. It's like they're just deranged individuals seeking an outlet. And the real villain is less of those specific individuals and more of like, systems and Lecter's kind of like this overarching presence that, well, too, in the difference.
Well, he says too, he wasn't born this way. He was made, and that's what the show Mindhunter is a lot about. Like these people are made because oftentimes it is the situation with their mother or something like that has born these serial killers.
And two, like, Mindhunter could almost be the prequel to Red Dragon or Manhunter and Silence of the Lambs. And then like the books themselves, like Red Dragon, like they're based in like contemporary when they were written, but was in the 80s or whatever. So, and two, part of the differences between those like stories. So in Red Dragon, the protagonist is Will Graham, who, obviously Will Graham is a man, and he is the agent who caught Hannibal Lecter. Clarice is a young female trainee who is, seeking his help. So the difference there is like in Red Dragon, Hannibal would like to kill Will Graham and tries to set up the scenario to allow that to happen. And then with Clarice, he's more interested in her as a person. So there's like a different dynamic there too. If you look at those, like the guy, he doesn't really care about beyond just like, you're an adversary, you caught me, so I don't like you. Yeah. And there's all the more, complicated, nuanced elements of the relationship. To Clarice, he's more interested in like learning about her and like what she's about. And at the end of the movie,
maybe he doesn't see her as evil either.
Yeah.
Like even the warden in Silence, he says, he thinks I'm his nemesis, and he's the one he goes after at the end.
Yeah.
So there could be something there to be said about, how he views men as well.
Yeah. And he tells Clarice that he won't come calling for her.
Yeah.
And it's because he respects her. And like Clarice even says, like, he would find it rude. So you know that there's like a begrudging respect there. And then Hannibal, evolves that relationship more. And the book and the movie vary in that the movie, ends with Clarice staying more true to her convictions. And the book has her going away with Hannibal or, whatever. So, or at least, being, interested in him. So, the storyline, and I think that's part of the reason that Jodie Foster and Jonathan Demme didn't want to come back for the sequel, is they didn't really want that to be the character arc of the character. Now, by the time the movie got completed, that wasn't what they did. But Silence of the Lambs to me was like such a great slice of time because it feels like that era, but also, like you said, doesn't feel. It's not plastered in the middle of that era.
Yeah.
Like Manhunter feels more dated because of the trappings visually that it used, and Michael Mann had come off of Miami Vice and TV stuff back in that era, so it felt very 80s. Silence of the Lambs, aside from like set dressing and stuff, it could be an episode of Mindhunter made today. And like the one thing that is interesting to watch is like the titles that come on in the sequence, like how not great they looked because that was just the era.
Yeah.
And now you can do something better in Premiere or Final Cut or iMovie just on your own personal computer at the beginning of the movie. But like overall, all the performances are killer. The story is very strong. It operates on multiple levels. Because there's probably a lot of people who watch it and only really get off on the Lecter and the serial killer stuff and don't really think about the subtly layered in stuff about sexism in the workplace and all that type of subtext. They just kind of gloss over that and only enjoy like the thriller elements.
Yeah. Dig into some more resources on this if you haven't really thought about that stuff before, because it's just eye-opening, and it shows you there's a different way to watch movies that certain movies you may glean more out of and you may appreciate more if like, hey, maybe I should start looking for different layers and looking at things at different angles, Yeah,
and too, like, to me, it's fascinating to think, so, Buffalo Bill is more of the traditional idea of a serial killer, more in like a Ted Bundy fashion of kind of, deranged, middle-aged white guy that kills people for whatever reason and does kind of grotesque things with them.
Was she a great big fat girl?
Yeah, was she a great big fat person? And then Clarice is like, that's the first thing that tips me off. But so you have like that prism of people being viewed. And in today's world, a lot of people who are mass killers are vastly different in how they operate. And instead of, kidnappings and, mutilations, it's more of just like using a firearm to kill a lot of people at once. So, and with those guys, a lot of those mass killers, they kill themselves before they're, detained by the police, or they do get caught somehow. But a lot of those people, like the mentality of that is so vastly different from like the idea of what a serial killer was in like 1991 or the 80s. Because back then it was more of like a deranged person going one by one and getting people that fit a specific mold and doing these things. And today there's people that seemingly want to kill just any and everybody in a spot because of some trauma they've experienced or their worldview. And it's just like a new Silence of the Lambs about somebody like that would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Or like that approach taken to. I'm sure there's stuff being made, and I'm sure there's terrible episodes of those procedural crime shows where they try to tackle it, like Law and Order SVU or something.
Yeah.
But like Silence of the Lambs, just one of those movies that works really well on multiple levels. All the performances are great, and it just made me want to see more of that world. And then when we finally got Hannibal, it really wasn't what a lot of people wanted. It was a vastly different movie. It was more of like a gore fest with, a lot of it set like in Italy and overseas, and like all these awesome locales. And you had Gary Oldman as kind of this deformed character that, Cordell, why don't you go and feed the pigs? And there's all this like violence.
And you have
gore.
Julianne Moore doing our best Jodie Foster.
Yeah.
It's not that stellar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really hard to step into the shoes of a character from such a beloved movie.
Well, I know. Yeah. I mean, Julianne Moore, I think she is a phenomenal actress, but yeah, there's something lost there when you're like, okay, I know this character as,
well, I mean,
Jodie Foster, and yeah.
It would be like, imagine when you go from Star Wars to Empire Strikes Back and you get someone different playing Han Solo.
Exactly.
You get rid of Harrison Ford.
It's like, yeah.
So even if you replace Harrison Ford with Christopher Walken or something, because I think Christopher Walken was actually in contention for Star Wars. If you just replace one good actor or actress for a different good actor, you get vastly different results because they're not the same person. And it just felt like the Starling we got in the follow up in Hannibal was different than the one we got in Silence of the Lambs. So something
else about that I noticed this time that that I was like, I mean, this is very specific, like a shot that I was noticing that, oh my gosh, why can't I think of his name? The director of Denny Villeneuve did in Blade Runner 2049, which he may have done this also too in Sicario and maybe even Prisoners, but he definitely did it multiple times in Blade Runner. It's like a 3/4 behind the shoulder shots of Ryan Gosling a lot, like almost from the backseat of a car, and it's just this, and that's what you see. And I don't know, there's just something very intriguing about it. And I always, watching that, I'm like, man, I love that shot. Like, I'm going to keep that in my mind. Like, there's just something about that is, I don't know what it is. And I think I've, heard that he very much loves Demi's work. And he does that shot from Clarice's perspective. Her bosses, she's looking at him. He's in the front seat, and it's that same 3/4 behind the angle shot. And so obviously, then Villeneuve took that directly from Demi. But just something I noticed this time that I hadn't seen pointed out before. That just so much of the framing is so deliberate, and it is layered throughout. Like, this is definitely a great film to study if you're into filmmaking. Because it is also very entertaining as well. It's just a masterfully made film, and it totally deserved the Oscar.
Yeah. Well, because it's even influenced, like that movie specifically influenced me on things, because in the, like, not to say that anything I've done is great, but like after the slasher, like, had characters looking into the camera, and then it was an interrogation scene. I was like, well, I mean, we didn't really have time to move the framing around and have all the close-ups and tight shots, but I was like, well, I think in the context like Silence of the Lambs, it worked because you kind of got across, the characters looking at each other.
Well, yeah. Well, it gives you confidence of like, okay, what did they pull off? Like, okay, I can kind of do this.
So I think that was a movie that, I'm sure there's plenty of movies that did all kinds of stuff, but like big movies that got a lot of notice and a lot of press and made a lot of money and won awards. It's somewhat at the time probably daring to have the characters looking straight into the camera.
Yeah.
And that just kind of showed people, it's like, well, you don't have to follow these templates. You can break rules and make rules and do whatever you want. And that movie, it worked really well. So, very influential movie on a lot of people.
One other thing, too, that they were talking about the special features, how it's like a mythical story. And Clarice is like a mythical hero that goes into the dark forest. So she goes into this dark world, and it's seeing all these dark things for the first time. And then her end goal is to kind of rescue the princess, which is
the girl that's been kidnapped.
And she is the daughter of a politician, so it's
she has prominence.
So it has prominence and stuff. And that's kind of her personal journey of her insight and also rescuing, which I think is something I didn't realize before until I was watching some of the behind the scenes stuff. So I'm really interested to check out the stuff on Criterion. I hope they add it to Filmstruck because they also add the supplements on there. So I'll definitely be checking that out when they do at some point. But I'm pretty much clear on this.
Yeah, I think we discussed something like in terms of giving it a score out of 10.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million things that keep discussing about it, but
covering a lot of the same ground.
A lot of people have talked this film to death.
I mean, to me, this movie is almost like a 10 out of 10.
Yeah,
it's a movie I can watch all the time. I can, anytime I catch it on TV, I can keep watching it and be, completely entertained. You
can jump in at any point.
And it's one of those movies that's really not hurt or helped by the other movies being made or the Hannibal adaptations. Like, it's its own thing. It doesn't have to really correlate to any of the other stuff made of the same characters in the same universe. It's just a movie that exists that, in my opinion, like in terms of the type of movie it is pretty flawless. And I can watch it a million times. And because I hadn't watched it in a while, so when I got ready to watch it for this podcast, I'm like, I'm kind of excited to watch this again because I just haven't watched it in its entirety in a while. So one of those rare movies that's a full recommend. It's a movie if you haven't watched in a while, give it another watch and look at some of those things we talked about, or look at some of those other video essays about it, because there's probably stuff in there that we didn't even pick up on that was going on. So it's one of those movies that I always love seeing whenever I catch on TV or get a chance to watch it. So I think that'll wrap up our review of our discussion of Silence of the Lambs. And if you're listening via iTunes, you can do us a huge favor and leave a review there. It helps other people find the podcast. You can follow all of our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Vimeo, even though I don't really use Vimeo much, Twitter. And then you can find all the links to all of them at housepavestore.com. And then if you want to find us specifically on the internet, you can find me on Twitter at William Caps.
And I'm at Blevin Sean.
But make sure you do follow our Instagram accounts, HBTVS_official, because we often will announce things we're going to be doing coming up on there, as well as our Facebook account and Twitter. So like I said, follow those at the housepavestore.com. But that will bring this episode of the House by the Video Store podcast to a close. Thanks for listening.
House by the Video